Hey, Chris Anderson.
Hey, quick fire. How are you
Where are
doing?
you? Yeah, I'm good. How are we doing?
We're tired but good. So anyway,
Okay, and now we're back. So,
we're-
well, hey, it's good to see you, and I'm glad things are going well on your
well,
trip. Yeah, and I should just say
how about
welcome.
you?
Yeah, I'm doing good. And yesterday I had a chance to go to Florida and visit the last surviving Ghost Army veteran, Bill Nall, and his wife.
Exciting.
And yeah, and I was down there. He's 102 years old, and it was a great trip. And Chris, he gave me a gift. I
Yeah.
he wanted to give me a knife. A knife.
Okay.
He wanted to give me a big
A big
knife.
knife.
And his wife talked him
Big
out of the
knife.
big knife. So he gave me a little knife. So this is the little knife. Okay. You ready? He said it's an Indian or Native American skinning knife. I said, I don't think I'll be
Okay.
using it for that purpose. But okay. Yeah. I'm excited to have it and probably don't want to tell Marilyn where we're putting it.
So you're gonna guard the front door with it, or what?
Yeah, right. Maybe just leave it by the front door just in case we have to get chippy with somebody.
Well, you said something about like you were like emailing or somebody a veteran from 10,000 feet, or what was that
I
about?
was on the airplane today, and I had a question, and about D-Day, and I have to find this person's name because you may know them, but I don't. But I found there was this person, and I emailed Joe Balkowski about it, and Joe Balkowski said, "Oh, you should talk to Major General so and so," and so I was like, John Rain, and
Okay.
Raen, and he said he's 104 years old. Well, he was the commander of the headquarters company of Fifth Rangers on D-Day. He was a captain on
Wow.
D-Day,
Holy
retired
shit.
major general, still alive. I emailed him. He emailed me back 5 minutes later, and I'm sitting there on this
Crazy.
airplane going, what is this world? I'm at 37,000 feet. I'm emailing a 104-year-old guy. He's responding. Wow. It just really blew my mind.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that was
Cool.
today on the way back. So listen, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast, we're glad you're here. And today we'll be talking about the Nazi mind. It's an encore episode, so let us know what you're drinking. And
Good one.
we want to make sure to mention to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. And you can join this group by clicking on patreon.com/history happy hour. So given
I think we
our
need to start shrinking the font.
yeah, exactly. Hey,
Yes.
Chris, I think we should probably get going. Given our so Wi-Fi, give me a cue and I'll play the open. Had a little Zoom failure here all of a sudden. That's what the delay was there. But the bar's open, Chris.
That is.
So what drove the thinking of Hitler and his followers? How did ordinary Germans come to embrace an ideology of hate and destruction? And we're going to talk about that today with Laurence Rees, who is the author of the book, The Nazi Mind, 12 Warnings from History. The former head of BBC TV History, Laurence is an acclaimed historian, documentary filmmaker, best-selling author. His books translated worldwide include Hitler and Stalin and the Holocaust, A New History. Laurence, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hi, yes, thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining us from your attic. So we appreciate
That's right, I'm
that.
locked in here.
Chris, do you have a cocktail today?
I do. I have wine
Excellent.
from the bar in the room. Yeah.
I am opening a Fiddler IPA. And how about you, Laurence?
I've got a cup of tea. You see, you guys, I can't drink like that anymore. Well, I'll never get to sleep. It's terrible. Being old, don't get old. Well, you've got old and you can drink. So I'm unlucky,
No. When I drink, I don't sleep well. I'll put that out there. I admit that. Laurence, okay. Your book is a history of Nazi Germany, essentially, leavened with psychological analysis of why people participated in some of the horrible things that the Nazis did. But you've structured it as a series of warnings. And I'm curious, warnings to who and why you chose to do that.
Well, that's an easy question to ask, but it'll take a moment or two to answer. I mean, as you mentioned, I always wanted to make documentary films, historical documentary films. And after Oxford, I was lucky enough to get into the BBC television and managed to make a lot of history documentaries. And once I started to meet former Nazis, former members of the Nazi Party, former members of the SS, this was a big turning point for me. And this is going back more than 30 years now. I was incredibly lucky in the films I was making at that time, because the fall of the Berlin Wall opened up a whole range of potential interviewees, archives, and so on that were available to us. Plus, these former members of the Nazi Party had reached an age, terrifyingly the age I am now, but which is really worrying, especially because I thought they were absolutely beyond ancient, but actually, anyway, and they had just of an age just to retire, still fully compos mentis, and were many of them keen to talk about their mentality and why they did what they did. And I was so fascinated by this because it wasn't what I expected. Many of the former Nazis that I met were intelligent, they were cultured, they had a sense of humor, that had been incredibly successful after the war. This one guy, one of the first I met, had a senior position in a German car company as an executive. Not what I'd imagined. As a general rule, of course, there were some who weren't like that, but not as a general rule what I imagined. And crucially, most of them were not sorry, but they felt if you only kind of understood what their situation had been, you'd think actually there's a reason all this happened. And I was fascinated by this because this was very, very strange. And I was reading at the time a German philosopher called Karl Jaspers, and he wrote of the Holocaust, that which has happened is a warning to forget it is guilt, it must be continually remembered. And so I called the series I made that called Nazis: A Warning from History, in the book I wrote, I called that Nazis: A Warning from History as that generalized sense. And that series was very successful. It transmitted in America, won a Peabody, won a number of other awards across the world. So it was a very successful series. But still the warning was very general. And then over the years since then, I've made many other television documentary series in this area. I've written many other books. But the central question, which is, how could those mentalities happen and what can we learn from it? I finally got round to writing the book now. And the reason it's a warning is because I don't believe history can have any lessons. A lesson to me is a scientific experiment. For example, supposing someone says, you hear people say, Churchill, the lesson of Churchill is don't appease dictators. And you think, well, if you know the history, you realize he sure thing didn't appease Hitler, but he appeased Stalin like crazy. So is the lesson appease some dictators under some circumstances, but not others under others? I mean, there's no lesson there. But there are warnings in this, in the sense that if you go to your doctor and you say, look, I'm smoking 100 cigarettes a day and drinking 2 bottles of whiskey, you'll go, well, I know some people might think they can live to 100 doing that, and maybe someone did, but I'm I'm warning you, as a tendency, it's not a good idea. And I think this history operates for us, if we analyze it, operates for us at that level.
Okay. So, Laurence, we're going to try to at least touch on 12, but I'm curious, as you approach the project, are these 12 areas that you found in your previous research? I mean, did you have these 12 in mind, or are these 12 you came to as you kind of looked at the project fresh?
But to be honest, both.
Okay.
Because for the very first time, what I did with it, I mean, I've always been, you're military historians, and I hugely admire military historians. I know Anthony Beaver and Max Hastings very well in my country, who are two of the most brilliant military historians. I'm not a military historian. What interests me much more is, as I say, is mentality, is the how was it possible, particularly in relation to the Holocaust? How was it possible that these people were able to do these things? How was it possible that Hitler could come to power and do this? How was it possible that Hitler was so popular in the 1930s, and so on and so on? Those sorts of questions, which relate really primarily to mentalities, have been what essentially my life's work been about. But I never consulted psychologists and neuroscientists before, because I was always very wary of that. I got a real particular dislike of psychohistory. If you've read Walter Langer's Mind of Adolf Hitler, which was written for the OSS during the war. I think it's just nonsensical. All his insights of Hitler, many of them, as I explain in the book, are completely kind of off the wall, warped. This isn't psychohistory. What I'm talking about is insights, for example, that a very great intellectual, American intellectual, Professor Robert Sapolsky, who is professor of neuroscience at Stanford. He was a great help for me with this book. What he talks about are general human tendencies in relation to social behavior. So, for example, the tendency of human beings to separate people into them and us categories. And them and us, the them and us dichotomy is the core centrality of Nazism. So for this book, for the first time, I was able to talk not just to him, but research a number of other psychological areas, although it remains very much a history. It's a history book informed on occasion by psychology. It's not a psychology book informed by history.
Right.
Well, it's a fascinating book, and I read it to the end, and I want to read it again, more slowly, because it's really quite amazing. One of the points that you make in the book, which resonates with everything that I think and feel, is that the people who headed up the Holocaust, who carried out the Holocaust, were not monstrous. I mean, all of them were not monstrous psychopaths or sadists. And I mean, I think we've all watched the movies about Nazi Germany, and the evil Nazi guy has always got this smirk and this riding crop and is always a tortuous bastard. But these were kind of everyday people, which is in some ways really even more scary. And you focus in particular on Reinhard Heydrich, who was a high-ranking SS officer, considered by many to be the architect of the Holocaust, considered a very dark figure. And you say, well, he wasn't a particularly fanatical Nazi. So what exactly I understand this is your entire book is the answer to this question, and you can't tell me the whole book right now, but what the heck is going on here?
Well, Heydrich is a fascinating character. I mean, what's very interesting about Heydrich is that he never wanted to be a Nazi. He wanted to be a naval officer. He joined the Navy, but he was forced in the early 30s to quit the Navy because he had an affair with a woman and allegedly had promised to marry her and didn't. And then he got married to somebody else. And this first woman was able, through connections, to make a big fuss with the bosses of the Navy, who held a court of judgment against him and essentially forced him out. But he never, if he hadn't, talking about counterfactual history, but if Heydrich hadn't slept with that woman, you know, he would have carried on through, and you wouldn't have heard of him apart from maybe Captain Heydrich, or maybe if he'd done really well, Admiral Heydrich during the war. It was him being chucked out the Navy that made him look around for essentially another source of employment. Of course, he was predisposed to much of what was going on with Nazism. He wasn't left wing. He came from a background that would make him predisposed to be at least open to considering what it would be to be a Nazi. But it was his wife who actually was very much more of a Nazi, who was pushing him towards meeting with Himmler. It met Himmler, they got on. He made Heydrich head of the SD, the intelligence section of the SS, and Heydrich saw, hey, this is a great career move. And then you see this again and again with human beings. It isn't a question of being cynical necessarily. It isn't that they're living a lie, but what I think is a generalized human tendency. And of course, there are people not like this, but as a generalized human tendency, what tends to happen is what happened to Heydrich, which is you become what is necessary in order to prosper where you are. So he had the predispositions to being this fanatical Nazi, but he becomes a fanatical Nazi as a result of the circumstances and the culture he's in. He's extremely good and talented at it, and believes what he is doing is right. All the hideous things he's doing is right. But I met people who knew Heydrich who said the thing you've got to understand about Reinhard is he was unbelievably cultured. He was a great violin player. His father was a great musician. He saw himself as this cultural force. And crucially, he saw the people he was instrumental in murdering, the heinous, terrible things he was responsible for. He saw them very much as the other, as the them. So I'm not even convinced he thought he was necessarily killing human beings.
Chris?
So hopefully we'll get through most of them, but yeah, so hopefully we'll get through most of them, but I'd like to start with some of the warnings and the questions I'm going to bring up are kind of seen through the lens of the Third Reich, but let's just start warning number one, spreading conspiracy. And one of the things that you talk about in that chapter is you talk about the psychological consequences of dishonesty. What were you kind of getting at there? What was the
crucial? I think that's the first chapter, and as you know, it's focused really on the First World War and the aftermath. And I think it's almost impossible to overestimate the importance of what happened in the First World War and the immediate aftermath of the First World War in the formation of the Nazi Party and in the rise to power of Adolf Hitler. I don't believe for a second you would have had the Nazi Party as it developed, or there was a possibility that Hitler becomes chancellor without the circumstances of the First World War and the aftermath. In fact, my great, over the last 35 years, my great intellectual guru, the person who has taught me so much, is a man called Professor Serene Kershaw, who is probably the world expert on Hitler, and is an extraordinary genius intellectual. And I talk to him all the time about these things. And I had lunch with him, and I said, when I was writing the book, I said, you know, Ian, I've really cracked it. Without the First World War, there could never have been a Second World War. And shows you why he's the great intellectual. He said to me, well, Laurence, if you think about it for more than a few seconds, you'll realize that without a First World War, you can't have a Second World War. And I thought, that's why you're Professor Big Brain, you know, but also I said, it's why you totally are missing the point. You know, I don't mean, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So that was, in fact, the opening line of the book, without the First World War. And then he was able to go, no. So, in fact, it was changed, thank goodness. But it's true, without the First World War, there's no Second World War. Without the First World War, there's how is there a Holocaust? Without the First World War, there's no hit, and so on. And why is that so central? It's so central for a number of reasons. And this is why, good luck getting through all 12 warnings, because when I give a lecture on this at these festivals, I do 3 because it's difficult. But so
we'll cherry pick them then. But
okay, you'll see how you get on. But with the reason it's so central is because they don't go into the war thinking it's going to go that way. They go into that First World War thinking they're going to do what Frederick the Great said the Prussian army should do, which is fight short but lively wars. They think they're going to come in through Belgium, straight round with the Schlieffen Plan, get to Paris. And they're going to do that in a matter of weeks. And they almost do it. They get as far as the Marne, as you know, in the First Battle of the Marne, where they're held. And then the war turns into a war that they never anticipate. It turns into this horrendous trench conflict, static war, which I don't believe for a second they can win. They don't have the resources to win that. So what do they do in that circumstance? What they do is the army starts lying. The army starts saying, well, the reason it's not going so well is because there are people back home, the socialist politicians, Jews, who are plotting, they're all plotting against this. The people on the front are the brave people who can win this war, and we're being betrayed behind the lines. And that reaches this great height in the immediate aftermath when Hindenburg, the Committee of Inquiry in 1919, says, yes, I agree, we were stabbed in the back. And this great stab in the back myth, the idea that they didn't really lose the First World War, it was the conspiracy, particularly of Jews, behind the lines, a lie, nonsense. That becomes taken up by a whole series of small parties on the right, the Volkisch right, particularly the Nazis. And if you look at Hitler's last testament, the thing he wrote just before he died in the bunker, he talks about, in this war, the Second World War, the Jews didn't get away with what they got away with in the First World War. It's almost like that's a war they know, even when the war's going against them in the Second World War, it's a war they know they can win, which is this war against the Jews. And the Jews this time aren't going to do to us what they did to us before. Again, you've got to keep saying it's a lie, but it's a lie they believe and sign into. And that gets allied to the fact that the revolutions at the end of the First World War in Germany are seen to be the result of socialists and communists, because bear in mind, Lenin's just had a revolution in Russia, and they believe, the Nazis believe, that Jews are behind communism. Lenin is not a Jew. I mean, it's an element of fantasy, of course, but as Chris Browning, the great Holocaust scholar, said to me, the Jew becomes like a buzzword for anything you don't like in terms of conspiracy. I was with one former Nazi in Germany, and it was raining, and he just looks outside, points to it, and goes, "Jew weather."
Oh, jeez!
Wow.
That's it becomes, and the thing about human beings, not just this, the thing about human beings, I think, is that many people, we know this in our own lives, it's so much easier to take disappointment and loss if you think there was a conspiracy amongst other people to make it happen, because then you don't have to take any responsibility. The only reason we lost was because those shadowy people plotted against us. So I don't think Hitler ever thought they lost the First World War. I mean, they lost it, but they didn't really lose it because they were betrayed. And never again.
So, Chris, I did not order my questions by the
well, that's fine. Well, we
warning.
Know we're gonna
So, do you want to do a second one now, or should I just go ahead and leave?
No, I think we've determined that we're not going to get through all 12 because poor Mr. Rees has many other interviews to do, and the show can't go on for a week. So, feel free to ask the questions.
No, because I talk too much.
No.
But you have to get ready for your 12 Spanish language interviews tomorrow.
I turned into this when I started out as a filmmaker 40 years ago. I'd interview and I'd talk to historians, right? And I'd go, "Can you just explain why this and that?" And they go, "Well, it's complicated." And I just go, "Oh, give me a break."
I want 3 sound bites from you. Right?
And I've turned into one of them. I go, "Well, I'm sorry."
Well, I'm a filmmaker as well, so I'm right there with you all the way. A couple of weeks ago, we had on a guest, Timothy Ryback. I don't know if you know him, who wrote the book Takeover about Hitler's rise to power. And there was a question I wanted to ask him. I never got to ask it, so I decided I would ask it to you. So sorry to give you kind of a used, somewhat old question. But it's something you talk about in your book. Why are people in Nazi Germany, well, in pre-Nazi Germany, in 1932, 33, why are they willing to vote for somebody who says out loud, not quietly, that if elected, he's going to put an end to democracy? I would, if somebody said that today, I would completely vote the other way against them. But somehow, even though I know Hitler never got a majority of the vote, the Nazis never got a majority of the Reichstag, he somehow manages to get people to support him despite that. And I've never understood that.
Okay. It's a key question, and one I've devoted a lot of time to. In fact, it's worse than you think, because a majority of people in Germany in 1932 voted for either the Nazis or the communists. And if you put those two groups together, it's a majority of Germans. And both of those parties, not just the Nazis, the communists too, were open in saying a vote for us is a vote to destroy democracy. So a majority of Germans in 1932 voted to never have the right to vote again. They voted their own democracy out. It's, as you say, it's an incredible idea. How could that happen? Well, obviously, there's a whole series of reasons why that could happen. The first is to understand, of course, the force of the influence of the Wall Street crash and the economic depression on Germany, which was horrific. If you look in 1928, the Nazi Party under Hitler got 2.6% of the vote. And you should remember that when people say, oh, it was his unbelievable charisma and hypnosis, that got me to... Nonsense. He'd been leader of the party for years. And in 1928, he gets 2.6% of the vote. There was a Prussian secret police report that says, essentially, we don't need to worry about these people. They're a joke. And yet, 5 years later, he's Chancellor of Germany, head of the biggest party. So, yes, of course, the economic terrible depression, the mass unemployment, the failure of banks, and so on is important. As is the political violence that happens between the communists and the Nazis. But crucially, I think, and this is the thing that's forgotten, crucially, what happens is the perceived failure of democracy to sort things out. Once Hindenburg, the president, removes a guy called removes the then chancellor. Once that happens, you have a series of governments where they're ruling by special decree from Hindenburg, and then another election. So they get trapped into this cycle of election, nothing much happening, another election, nothing much changes, election, another, nothing much changes. So they're continually in this cycle. And the perception amongst many, many, many people is we've got a huge concern, which is this political violence and the terrible, terrible suffering of the depression. And we keep voting to try and sort it out. But over that 2-year period, 3-year period, nothing is sorted out. Democracy, demonstrably, doesn't work for them. And I think that's a huge, it's not one of my warnings in the book, but it's an overall thought for us, which is what happens to a society when people feel they have an overarching concern about something and no political party is dealing with it, no matter how they keep voting. Well, I think what happens is a possibility is what happens is you come to the conclusion that democracy doesn't work and you look for alternatives. And I think you can see that across many, many countries in the world. Now, not so much in a destruction of democracy outright as happened in Germany, but in the appointment of strong men leaders who then start demolishing democracy or lessening democracy by altering the ability of people to vote, by destroying the free press, by altering the appointments procedure for judges. There's a whole number of things you can do to a democracy to massively undermine it, to make sure you stay in power. I mean, Putin says he's living in a democracy. I mean, they vote for him, don't they? But that's what I think is a crucial reason. That's the crucial reason to me that this happens by 1932, which is democracy has for millions and millions of people been seen to fail to address their major concerns.
Laurence, could you talked about, as you were interviewing all of these Germans over the course of your career, kind of the duality of the German personality, the German psyche. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I think that there's a duality in kind of there's two forms. There's a duality.
It's a complicated.
There's the duality of them at the time. And crucial to that is this psychological dichotomy of them and us, which is it's crucial for them to believe that the people who they are torturing and murdering aren't them. I mean, sorry, aren't us. They're not like us, you know, they're not like us. There's this total themness to it. And as Sapolsky said to me, apropos of the Jews, there becomes something called pseudo-speciation, which means you don't even consider them human. And that's when you see the propaganda of Jews as rats or Jews as snakes, Jews as vermin, because it creates in the mind images of these vermin, and that creates kind of an emotional response that's very much as if they were really that. I mean, it creates that. So there's a duality there, because you know, you're saying, how can they kill these people like this? Well, they're killing many of them. They're thinking they're killing people who aren't like them, is a crucial element to it. And then there's the duality that happens after the war, which I encountered a number of times from former Nazis, which is the view that, and so for example, I met a man called Oscar Gröning, who we got this amazing interview with, who worked at Auschwitz. He actually was in the economic division of Auschwitz. He used to work in the bank before the war, joined the SS, posted to Auschwitz, and he spent his time counting the money of murdered Jews. And he saw what was going on in Auschwitz, knew everything that was going on in Auschwitz. And he said, well, I accept now that what happened there might be terrible, might be perceived as terrible. But at the time, you have to understand that the view was that the Jews behind the lines, i.e. Jewish civilians, are just as much an enemy as the enemy at the front line, and they must be exterminated. So he held the view that there were almost two people who were him. There was the him then that believed what they were doing was right, and there was the him now who can look back and is not prepared to say what he did was wrong, but he can understand now why people might think it was wrong. So he's kind of like split himself into two people, neither of whom at the time did anything wrong.
Well, Rick, can I?
Go ahead.
I want to expand on that too, because another thing that came out of that interview with him is, I kind of say it's the moral equivalency argument that, you know, what we did may have been bad, but you bombed Dresden.
Yeah.
Right?
It's central. But you see that it's a completely central argument. I mean, they were the kings. There were so many before us. Goebbels was the king of whataboutism. Yeah. You know, there's a really fascinating bit I discovered in a speech. I think it was a speech or a private speech Goebbels gave to journalists around about the time when it was becoming known what they were doing during the war in killing mass numbers of Jews. And he essentially said, look, they said we'd killed, I can't remember the figure, 2 or 3 million Jews.
2.5 million, yeah.
Yeah, they said we'd killed all these people. But actually, maybe it's a bit less. But he said there's no point in propaganda terms in saying, hey, you're wrong. There's still going to be a problem. So what we're going to do is say, how many people have been killed in the British Empire? How many Native Americans did the America? That becomes like this sense of, hey, come on, shape up. We're human beings. This is what human beings do. Yeah, yes, you can be nasty. It's a war and so on. Plus, they believe that we're responsible in some respects for the Holocaust, because in 1938, Roosevelt convenes the Evian Conference.
Yeah.
And nobody's prepared to take large numbers of Jews. And then for the Nazis, this is a seminal moment that people don't recognize, which is what they see then is, oh, right, you're all hypocrites. You say we're terrible, but we're just the only honest people in the world. So there becomes that sense of they're driven to it. They're driven to a course of action that they wouldn't have liked. They'd have loved all these Jews to be taken away somewhere else. And bear in mind, these are horrible, horrible things I'm saying, but I'm talking about trying. It's important, understanding is not to excuse the terrible crimes, but it's the duty of the historian to try and understand. And so this is the level of mentality that many of them are operating on. And then you add to that the whole bombing war, and the sense that as essentially Hearst, the commandant of Auschwitz, wrote in his memoirs just before he was hung. He said, well, yes, essentially he says, I'm guilty like bomber pilots who bombed Hamburg are guilty, and someone else I remember said to me, well, yes, I mean, do you think the children we killed in our gas chambers suffered more or less than the children you incinerated in the firebombing of Hamburg or Dresden? So that becomes that and that's an argument that they're very, very fond of. I don't believe there's a moral equivalence between those two things for all the complex reasons I explain in my writing. But nonetheless, for them, it creates this sense of, yeah, come on, you're just all hypocrites.
I know that was very chilling to read that in the book, and very thought provoking. And Joseph Goebbels pops up a lot in your book, and a very fascinating guy because he keeps a very detailed diary, which runs all the way through the 30s and through up until basically a few days before he dies. And he just looks on Hitler as a hero, right? He is bedazzled and mesmerized by Hitler. And he seems like a smart person. I'm wondering what gave Hitler this power over Joseph Goebbels, over others?
The key thing about what's going on with Goebbels, I think, is what you got to understand. For every single member of the Nazi Party is the shadow of the First World War, and it operates at a number of levels. It operates for those people who fought in it. It operates for those people whose parents fought in it and they didn't get the opportunity to fight in it. And it operates for someone like Goebbels, and indeed Himmler, but Goebbels particularly, who, because of a disability, couldn't fight in it. So there's a real sense of missing out, of not being shown to be a true man, I think, behind a lot of things that are going on with him. And it's clear from his diaries, entries in the early 1920s, that he's looking for a belief. He's looking for something. He's looking for something to hang on to in those turbulent times. And he happens upon Hitler. But it's more complicated than just he's kind of like mesmerized and hypnotized by Hitler, because actually he has a big argument in the mid-1920s with Hitler over the issue of Nazi policy. And in the end, he understands that unless he goes along with where Hitler wants to go, he's not going to convince Hitler. No, it's very, nobody goes into a room and convinces Hitler by logical argument. He's not going to be part of this. He either gets on the boat or he gets off the boat. He gets on the train or he gets off the train. And he decides big time he's going to get on the train. And then in his diaries, what he's careful to do he sold the publication rights to those diaries. So he's also, it's not quite a private diary in the sense that he thinks one day this stuff might be published. Maybe bowdlerized, maybe edited, but it might be, and he thinks, so there's a sort of sense, I think, in it that he's also got this eye for it about who do I want to be? I want to be a hero, and I want to be the hero who follows this great godlike figure. But equally, he believes a lot of it. And he believes a lot of it because he absolutely begins to trust in Hitler's genius, because events start going the Nazis' way. And particularly in the early 1930s, when actually Hitler is holding out against being made vice chancellor, and it turns out to be right. And so Goebbels begins to think this is confirmation of the fact that this guy's got a natural gift for politics. We got to absolutely go with this.
Go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just going to say I had a bit of a drag. We had a question here from Frank. And Frank says he's currently reading and enjoying the book. And can we deduce that the loss of trust in institutions such as government, military, religion was the key to the development of these warnings?
Certainly, you're absolutely right that it's the loss of trust in government. It's the loss of trust in democracy that is the centrality of this turning point. Then it's really not so much the loss of trust in institutions as the suborning of institutions. So you look at what he does, for example, Hitler with the army. There's a lot of army officers who really absolutely think Hitler's a jerk. A lot of them are aristocrats. They think, my God, as President Hindenburg did of Hitler. I mean, he thought he was the famous story of Hindenburg meeting Hitler for the first time and then saying, well, he's fit only to be postmaster general, because then he can lick my backside. Meaning that as postmaster general, he would, he'd be dealing with stamps with Hindenburg's face on it. So Hindenburg recognized, lots of people there in the elite recognize that this is not an impressive individual. But for the army, I met many army officers who recognized in that key period, January 1933, when Hitler's appointed chancellor, to August 1934, when Hindenburg dies. They are involved with They are involved with supporting the Nazis, partly and to a large extent because Hindenburg gives it his imprimatur. And Hindenburg is doing it because he actually distrusts democracy and is looking to undermine and remove democracy. And Hitler is the guy who can do it for him. And they hope to surround Hitler with a load of other people from the conservative elite who can kind of manage him. It's one of the greatest misjudgments in history, but that's the plan, and it goes badly wrong. But so the army as an institution stays all the way through this, right the way through until they start in July 1944. Religion is a whole separate topic, because Hitler recognizes that though he thinks, as he later says, Christianity is the invention of sick minds, he absolutely doesn't go with it. He's sufficiently politically astute to recognize that large numbers of his supporters are Christians. So he's never going to go absolutely out to remove that. He thinks Christianity can be dealt with, quote, after the war. But prior to that, he's treading, he thinks he's boxing clever with it, and in removing dissidents, in ensuring that actually it doesn't become a threat to him, and so on. So it's kind of like the institutions remain, courts remain, but then separate to them become the concentration camps. So the sort of structures are there, but they're hollowed out and corrupted from within.
I wanted to ask about Hitler. You write, Hitler was never an all-powerful leader, which I It's one sentence, but I think it goes up against this common conception that Hitler is the absolute ruler with power of life and death over everyone in Europe. So how or why do you disagree with that?
Well, has there ever been an absolute ruler with power of life and death without having to consider power groups? Who? I can't think of anybody, no matter how much power. Look at the Caesars. I mean, they may have had, Caligula may have had power. He thought he had power a lot of the time, but he's looking over his shoulder all the time at when he's going to be stabbed by the Praetorian Guard. Every single leader is managing power groups and influential groups.
So what are power groups that Hitler is concerned about?
The army. He's got issues with the army from almost from the beginning. Christian Church. When the Bishop of Munster during the war speaks out against the euthanasia campaign, they're murdering selected disabled people in gas chambers before they're murdering Jews in gas chambers. And when this Bishop of Munster gets to hear about this, he speaks out against it. He actually speaks out about this. And you would think, well, of course, that's it. The Gestapo are going to come around and put him in a, nothing like that happens. Why? Because Hitler recognizes that he's got soldiers on the Eastern Front who are devout Christians, many of them. And once he starts turning on prominent Christian bishops, yes, he can go after certain members of certain members of the leaders of the Christian faith when he feels it's able. I mean, but he believes it's at a critical moment when he can't do it. There's a big scandal just before that in Bavaria when the local Nazis in Bavaria start removing crucifixes from schools, and there's open protests in Nazi Germany, and as a result they back off. So they're absolutely have got to be careful how they're managing. He's got to be careful how he's managing things. You look at how he has to manipulate and force the army to come up with plans to invade Western Europe in 1940. And they're fighting against that in many, many ways. And he actually has to keep having these meetings to persuade them. There's a line in his table talk, which I think I quote in my book on the nature of his charismatic leadership. And I use charisma in the Max Weber sense there of it, meaning that it's a description of a type of leadership. It's not like we think charisma is necessarily positive. It's a neutral thing, charisma. But there's a line where he says, my whole life has been persuading people. Well, that's not what you associate with an all-powerful ruler. Why, if you're an all-powerful ruler, why are you going to persuade anybody? But he sees his life as, my life has been about persuading people.
Chris, I think it's you. Chris looks for okay.
So I've just looked at the clock and I realized we've gotten through one warning. So you were right, Laurence. But, we're not going to get through 12.
Yeah. We're going to keep this up for 12 hours.
My miscalculation. That's right. But one thing I do want to ask, and it will sort of tie into the book, but I have been a huge admirer of your work for a great many years. I play all of your documentaries on all of my tours. I recommend your books to my guests. And one of the reasons for that is you are able to extract testimonies from people involved in this period, Nazis and others, that are far beyond what you usually get when you hear these interviews, confessions and honest answers. How are you able to do that? What do you think that you're bringing to these conversations that gets somebody like, groaning to say, well, yeah, this is what I did. This is what I thought. Or I think that you're able to get more honesty out of them.
It was first of all, working in the BBC, when I did, we had brilliant production teams and brilliant researchers working for us as well. And we were funded such that we could do a huge amount of investigative journalism. because for every one person you put on camera, there might be 20 or 30 you've traced, and you can't persuade to do it.
Yeah.
So you're seeing the tip really of an iceberg. And for those people who agreed to do it, I never asked why they agreed to do it. I just didn't want to go there. I mean, they've agreed to do it. That's great. Guessing, I think it was often a number of reasons across a number of different people. The first is age. Once they're in their late 60s, early 70s, they're kind of not too far from the end of the road. And there's a sense, many of them had, and this was interesting, many of them had grandchildren. And I think you have a different relationship with your grandchildren than your children. I don't have grandchildren yet, I haven't got children, but as I understand it, I think you do. And these grandchildren were saying, Grandpa, I love you, but apparently you're a Nazi. What's going on there then? And they had a kind of desire, many of them, to say, just understand the situation, what's going on, understand what's happening. And many of them believe, for example, they were right because they should never have gone to war with Britain. They wanted a partnership with Britain. I thought it would be a negative coming from the BBC. It was a positive because actually many of them hugely admired the British or the English as they saw it because of the British Empire, and they trusted the BBC not to misrepresent them on film. And what was amazing was I was keen that in each film it has a moral position, the film, which was that you were going to make sure that you said, well, what you did was appalling, what you did was disgraceful. And I thought many of them would go, oh, shut up, walk out. Yeah. No, those questions often got the best answers because they wanted to push back against it. They say, well, you say that, but let me tell you, and it was an incredible contrast with interviewing or filming interviews with members who say the Stalin secret police, as we did for a series about the war in the East. They were the ones who were saying, oh, wow, we were acting under orders because if I didn't do it, I'd be shot. And you realize that just shuts down everything. Because where do you go from that? No former Nazi we ever interviewed said that. Right. And the reason they didn't say it is because they knew they wouldn't be shot. No one was shot for not taking part in the Holocaust. Nobody. They're doing it in many respects because they think what they're doing is right. And that's what's ultimately so tremendously scary about what's going on here.
Yeah.
Laurence, we're coming towards the end of the hour, but toward the end of your book, you say that the central message you take away from your work is that everything is more fragile than we think. So expand on what you mean by that, and if we develop that belief, how should we react to that today?
Well, I've met so many people whose lives were turned apart in an instant, going right across the thing. The Jews of Hungary, who were relatively okay, still persecuted, but relatively okay up until 1944 when the Nazis moved in. And then within a few weeks, many of them are dead in Auschwitz. Just it went. The people in Germany who thought, we interviewed socialist politicians who believed that it wasn't going to be such a big deal when Hitler comes to power because, well, he'll fail and then it'll be our turn. Whoosh, it changes. And I think what we do in our lives, like them, is we take everything for granted, and we take things for granted because in many ways life would be intolerable if we didn't. One of my wife's friends, they were in Ibiza recently on holiday, and he was in his early 60s and he just died in the night of a heart attack. What sense do you make of that? You couldn't live your life if you thought, my God, if I'm going to go to bed tonight, I'm going to die. But, that just as our bodies are more fragile than we think, the institutions around us are potentially more fragile than we think. The rule of law, for example, or the freedom of the press. These are tremendously, inherently fragile things that can change in an instant. Yes, they may not change, but it's a bit like a kind of fragile piece of glass you've got on the mantelpiece. It may not be knocked off for years, but it's inherently fragile in that when it does go, it goes big. And yet you don't think, I think that, as they say, right across the board, that was the central message I took from people. So it's made me incredibly conscious of that. Like I said, 2.6% of the vote in 1928, written off as a joke. A few years later, he's chancellor. Well, what's that but demonstrating the immense fragility of that political system? And I think we're all living through a period now, which is why I wrote the book. We're all living through a period where that fragility is inherent, and it's obvious. It should be obvious.
Laurence Rees, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about your book, The Nazi Mind. Chris, I would recommend this book. I think you would too.
It's stellar. And again, once we have him on for 11 more shows, we just have 11 more parts.
And can I apologize for coming on a show called History Happy Hour and not being happy and being
no.
I kind of come into people's lives and I depress them.
Well,
but imagine living with me, I mean, it's hell. So you've only had me for an hour.
This is a fundamental contradiction in our show because there are many, many non-happy topics.
It's the duality of the show. So
but we'd love to have you come back sometime. I know you're getting started on your next book, so perhaps there's be a reason to bring you back. And everybody, again, one more time, I'll show the cover. The Nazi Mind, 12 Warnings from History by Laurence Rees. Please, please, please check it out. Yeah. Laurence, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
I love that look on your face. Yes, you look beatific. Okay.
Beatific.
Yeah. So next week we are back live and we'll be talking with Brooke Newman, who is the author of The Crown's Silence, a book on slavery in the British Crown. And I'm sure that Chris, you hope that they find the British Crown to be completely not involved in slavery, but I'm expecting that perhaps the story will be slightly different.
You say, okay, we'll see.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, thank you everybody for joining us today. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, and back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.